Good evening. Thanks for coming. We're going to get started on time and try and get you out of here on time. Appreciate your being with us tonight. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West, and we're going to keep on our global theme of lecture topics tonight and talk about international trade and trade agreements and what they mean for us as a nation and our economy. And we're very happy to have our colleague Joshua Meltzer back out from Brookings. This is Josh's second trip to Las Vegas, so he knows everything there is to know about us right now. Like our other scholars, he's talking in classes, giving lectures, meeting with students and faculty. So Josh comes to us from Brookings, where he's in the Global Economy and Development Program. I just want to read a little bit about you because of Josh's interesting background. He's an expert on international trade, of course, but he's also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins, their School of Advanced International Studies, and at Georgetown University Law School. And prior to Brookings, he was the first Secretary for Trade Policy. I shouldn't tell you what country, I should make them guess, right? But it's spoiler alert, it's the Australian Embassy, in case you can't tell. And there he focused on climate change, energy issues, and trade. He holds degrees from Monash University in Melbourne and also law degree from the University of Michigan. So he brings a unique and interesting perspective to this topic. Josh's PowerPoint will be up on our website tomorrow if you want to refer back to it, as will the video of the talk in a few days, thanks to our colleagues here at Greenspun College. So I'll turn it over to Josh.
Thanks, Bill, for that very generous introduction. And I am Australian, so I will do my best to speak slowly and clearly. You know, if there's any doubt about what I'm saying, please raise your hand. I'm going to do a brief presentation, and then we can open up for some Q&A. And what I want to talk about today is, you know, essentially this is going to be a discussion about what's the trade policy landscape in the US, you know, coming out of Washington DC and how it looks globally. But what I want to do before I get into what's actually specifically happening with the trade negotiations, talk a little bit about, you know, the changing global economy and why, you know, trade agreements and the types of opportunities that they're going to provide are important for the US. So, I've just done what I was told not to do. Okay, so here, the first slide here, you know, just is an observation about the level of economic growth that's now occurring outside the United States. The United States is still, you know, well and truly the world's largest economy, you know, over twice as large as China, the world's second largest economy. But you're seeing a lot of actual growth happening in the developing world, which you would expect to see. There's a lot of catch-up that has to happen in the developing world, and we're finally seeing what, you know, looks to be like a period of convergence where you're getting faster growth rates in parts of Africa, parts of Asia, some parts of South America, and, you know, the trend line seems to be over time towards a certain level of catch-up with the developing world, which from, you know, a development perspective is clearly good because people are being brought out of poverty. And from a trade and economic perspective, it raises new opportunities, new challenge for the United States, for the developed world broadly, but also, and what we're going to talk about tonight is the opportunities that the growth in the developing world provides for the US. So this slide here is a observation about the middle class breakdown broadly as of 2009, and as you can see, these are global numbers in terms of, you know, 18% of the global middle class located in you know, North America, 36% in Europe, and so you would expect, you know, you have to keep in mind these figures when you think about the US population as a share of the world is only about 5%, yet 18% of the middle class is in North America. So, you know, obviously these numbers picking up the enormous wealth of North America and Europe, but you do see growing middle class in the Asia Pacific region. We're seeing that certainly in countries like Thailand, obviously bits of China, India and the like. But here you begin to see the changes that are going to be, these are all estimated out to 2030, where as a share of the global middle class, the growth in the Asia Pacific region in particular is potentially enormous. So this is not a decline in absolute terms in any way in the US middle class. It's just that the share of the global middle class declines as the actual pie, the global middle class broadly grows. And most of that growth is going to be in China, it's going to be in India. We've got, sort of 2.5 billion people in those two countries alone, a lot still living in poverty, so, enormous scope to lift people out of poverty. Now, these are not middle class in China and India even in 2030 is going to be nothing like middle class in Europe or United States, right? I mean, these are still, even by 2030, per capita levels in China will be at least half of that of the United States. So the United States and Europe will still be very significantly richer countries. But in terms of how you would define middle class for those countries, the growth will be enormous. So just putting some numbers on what we're talking about here in terms of middle class consumption. And I focus on the middle class because that really is, for any country, always a key driver of growth. It's a key driver of consumption. It's sort of a platform for a lot of the things that we associate with developed countries. Certain forms of political stability, certain expectations around healthcare and education and the like. And so as the middle class, whereas what we've been seeing in the developing world in the past is sort of wealthy elites and large sort of poor, we're going to see increasingly more broad-based growth. And it's this type of broad-based growth which is going to, create the opportunities in the middle class, and as we're going to see, is going to be an engine and opportunity for trade. So in 2000, global middle class consumption was approximately $17 trillion. By 2020, that number is expected to double. So we begin to see the size of the opportunity that we're talking about here. And again, most of this growth is going to happen in the developing world. So in terms of US trade as a significant component of overall economic growth, it's approximately 33% of total GDP. So it works out usually about 16-17% of GDP is probably imports, maybe 15% is exports, and usually there's a trade deficit of varies between 2, 3 and 4% of GDP. Now these numbers, this is actually a relatively low number for the developed world. In fact, the average sort of trade as a share of GDP for developed countries is much higher than this. It's actually more around 60 or 70% of GDP. So the US actually trades little compared to the size of its economy, and there's a variety of reasons for this, but it's worth just pointing out in terms of there's a lot of opportunities there for trade to make an increasingly large share of GDP, and where really the share is lower than expected is much more on the export side than the import side. US imports of about 16-17% of GDP are a little bit closer to the norm, but exports of only around 15% of GDP compared to, if you look at Germany, or if you look at France, or you look at the UK, or you look at Canada, exports are much larger as a share of GDP, and there's a lot of opportunity for exports to make a much larger share of GDP in the US going forward. Just talking about jobs briefly, because obviously at the end of the day we're interested in this because we're interested in growth, we're interested in the welfare opportunities, and we're interested in the job implications of all of this. These are estimates at some level, but this is sort of data that the government uses to correlate export growth and job creation in the United States. And basically the sums are that every $1 billion in exports supports 5,600 US jobs. So quite a strong an important driver of growth. And in fact, you know, another important data point here is that for those working in industries that are export orientated, wages are about 15 to 18% higher than equivalent wages in that industry that is not export orientated. So working in fact in export orientated industry is also good for wages. I also wanted to give you a figure here which breaks out exports and jobs both in terms of goods and services, because I think it's worth thinking a bit more about trade and about the differences between goods and services, because often the debate is very focused on goods, and often actually it's really focused on manufacturing. I'm sure for anyone who pays any attention to this issue, you hear stacks about the impact of trade on manufacturing, the impact of trade on jobs in the manufacturing sector, but you know, it's worth putting this in some perspective. The manufacturing sector in the United States is around about 10-11% of GDP. It represents about 10 to 11% of total manufacturing jobs. Services represent pretty much the rest. You know, it's close to 75-80% of US GDP is actually driven by services. And as you can see, in fact, that services exports actually create more services jobs than goods exports. Now, if you go to, if you look at the composition of US exports, about 2/3 of US exports are goods and about 1/3 are services. Now, there are limitations. This sort of doesn't really provide, I think, a good sense of the importance of services in US exports, because, as you would know, a lot of services are actually used in the production of goods. So if you think about a car, for instance, or you think about a computer, you think about any type of manufactured good, it often involves and requires a lot of services inputs to actually make that good. At one end, you've got the R&D, and you've got the design, you've got the sort of accounting and legal and consulting and those types of services, you've got the sales and aftercare types of services that actually are provided, you've got advertising, marketing. So in fact, there's a lot of services effectively that are sort of embodied in goods. And it's true also, obviously, when it comes to the exports of those goods. So in fact, these goods figures actually contain a lot of services. And if you break out, in fact, the value of services in goods exports, the data actually shows that, in fact, the US already exports, already over 55% of US exports are, in fact, services, some of them being services directly exported, some of them being services exported in goods. And obviously sitting here in Las Vegas, you know, this is a great town to talk about services, because this is a services-driven economy almost entirely. You know, this is tourism services, gambling services, hospitality services. So, you know, the importance, I don't think I have to convince you of the importance of services for economy, and also the way and the opportunities that services can provide. It also remains true that you know, exporting services, the barriers to services export tend to actually now be some of the most significant barriers that are out there. There's been actually a lot of success over the many, many years of trade negotiating rounds in reducing tariffs on goods. Services has only been a focus sort of for international trade in the last 10, 15, 20 years, and it's been a lot harder to reduce barriers on services. Part of that reflects the newness of it. Part of it reflects, you know, sometimes there's quite deeply different cultural and historical reasons why one country regulates services in one way and not in another way. I mean, you know, and so getting at that can actually be quite challenging from a negotiating perspective. But, you know, this is where the next sort of frontier is in terms of, you know, trade negotiations and in terms of what the opportunities are for US and growing US exports. Okay, so let me now talk a little bit about the types of negotiations that are happening at the moment, which, you know, are basically about trying to turn this framework into an opportunity for US businesses and entrepreneurs. I think it's probably not a stretch to say that we are currently in probably one of the most active, dynamic sort of trade agendas that the US has probably, you know, if not ever had for a very long time. And this has sort of come about for a variety of reasons, and I'll get back to this in a little bit later, but I want to sort of go through what are the really key trade negotiations that are out there, what the opportunities are, and what this could potentially mean. I think the most significant negotiation at the moment is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership Negotiation, and you can see the countries that are involved in it. So you've got a mix of, you've got your sort of traditional NAFTA countries that are involved, some countries in South America, specifically Peru and Chile, and then you've got countries in the Asia-Pacific region, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore. Now, the TPP is significant for a whole variety of reasons. One is that it's actually already quite an important trade agreement just by the sheer weight of the countries involved. So we're talking about, 40% of global GDP, close to a third of global world trade is covered by this agreement. It's, the combined, so we're talking about, $17–18 trillion worth of GDP here. Now, the important thing to note, there's a couple of things here. One is that this is important in and of itself. It's also important because there's an ambition for this to become a lot bigger. This is an explicit goal of the US administration. It's actually an explicit goal of all the TPP parties. And we actually are seeing that other countries are now indicating that they want to join. So South Korea, Taiwan, Colombia, the Philippines, Thailand, just to name a few, I think are very keen to join. And once this agreement is sort of finalised, there's going to be a next sort of stage where you're going to see countries actually join. So this agreement is going to expand and become much larger. So the significance is also built into that potentiality. The other bit going on here, of course, is that there's both going to be an opportunity here in terms of creating new market access opportunities, so reducing barriers to trading goods, reducing barriers to services, new exports in the United States. And there's also another component to this, which is about creating new rules for how economic growth should happen in the Asia-Pacific region in the 21st century, essentially. And this is what I would term sort of the strategic component of the TPP, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. On the market access side, you might have observed that the US already has trade agreements with some of the parties to this. The obvious one being NAFTA. So in some respects, this is going to be an updating of NAFTA, but it's not going to, on a market access sense, lead to massive new gains, because North America is already a fairly liberalised continent. There are some barriers in some areas which the parties are going to try to address in this agreement, but it's not going to be enormous. The US also has free trade agreements with some of the other countries here. So it has a trade agreement with Chile, it has a trade agreement with Peru, it has one with Australia. And so, the market access gains from having these countries in the TPP will be trying to build on what they've already done, but it's not going to be, that significant. The main gain here is going to be the negotiations with Japan, where there's no bilateral trade agreement. And I'm sure, as we've all been, if you think back to the 70s and 80s, where now all we think about is the competition from China, but it used to be Japan, right? And how the enormous trade deficit that the US ran with Japan, and everyone was scared that Japan was going to buy out the United States, etc. And then Japan went through 15 years of basically no economic growth, and that kind of fear fell away, and it really has been probably replaced by China more recently. Japan is a fascinating market, still a very, very significant economy, the world's third largest economy, very wealthy still, with lots of opportunities for the United States. Not on the services side, absolutely, very closed services market, but also in areas like agriculture, automobiles, and across the board. So, but the negotiations are really hard, but progress is certainly being made, and that's where a lot of the gains on the market access side, at least under this set of countries, is going to be. Now, in terms of the rules bit, what we're going to see is a whole lot of new stuff that has never really made its way into trade agreements. And this is partly a reflection that the countries really want this to be a 21st century trade agreement. They want it to deal with issues that were not dealt with in the past in the World Trade Organization when it was started. And I'm going to talk about the WTO shortly. And so we're going to see rules on things like the internet and cross-border data flows and on supply chains. And we're also going to see rules on things like state-owned enterprises. Why? Because part of this the thinking behind the TPP is that the US and sort of liberally minded, market-orientated economies want to provide a template for economic growth which is increasingly looking a little bit different to the way China has been developing. China increasingly has gone down a more state-orientated path of development. There's certainly an important role for the market there, but it is absolutely also true that state-owned enterprises are increasingly dominant players in the Chinese economy. China's not the only country with state-owned enterprises. The US has state-owned enterprises, Canada has state-owned enterprises, but they're not anywhere near as significant as what happens in China. Vietnam has state-owned enterprises, Singapore, etc. So there's an attempt here to say, what's going to happen in the TPP is no rules which say you can't have state-owned enterprises, but essentially saying, look, if you're going to have them, you want to create a level playing field so that companies can compete fairly. So you want to sort of roll back unfair subsidies in those markets. You don't want to give them sort of support which tilts their sort of competitive opportunities in one direction and the like. And this is sort of an attempt really to respond to the types of trajectories that China and some countries are looking to go down over the course of this century. And this is also part of why the TPP is seen as a 21st century trade agreement. I'm going to come back to, because I talked about the strategic component to it, and there is an important bit to it. I'm going to come back to it because I first want to talk about the next important trade agreement, and that is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations. So this is happening in parallel to the TPP negotiations, and it's basically an attempt to negotiate a free trade agreement between the US and Europe. Now this has never been done before. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and the fact that the US and Europe have decided now's the time to do it is in itself significant for a whole bunch of reasons. One of them is that we're talking about the world's two largest economies. Europe as an economy is basically similar in size to the US, and so you see that we're getting close to 50% of global GDP when you add the two economies together, 25%. That share of world trade breaks down to about 25% of exports, about 30% of imports. So a very sort of significant economic grouping in and of itself. In fact, the economic relationship between the United States and Europe is the most significant economic relationship by absolute none. I mean, by a factor of many. There's about $1 trillion of trade between the US and Europe annually. There's about $4 trillion in investment in each other's economies. We hear a lot about US investment in China. US investment in China is about 1.5% to 2% of total US investment overseas. There's about 60% of US investment is in Europe. US investment in Europe is about 14 to 15 times larger than US investment in all the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, China, India. So, the relationship's mature, it's long-standing, and it's very, very significant. So what this also means is that what the US and Europe managed to agree is in many respects going to become a global standard, because even though it's only sort of two economies, because they're such large economies and because they're very developed economies, you'll see that the standards and the rules in that will mean that other countries are going to sort of, in a sense, have to meet those standards and rules if they want to sell into the United States and Europe. And so in that sense, the outcome here will, in a de facto sense, become globalised. And so, and the US and Europe are very explicit about that, about it wanting to be a global standard and to set new rules, etc. And so there's that added sort of importance to actually what's agreed in there. Now, this is a really hard negotiation. I mean, they're all hard, but I think this is almost harder than the TPP. The TPP is close to being finalised. If you want to be optimistic, I'd say we're going to finish it this year. The TPP is now all dependent on Congress passing this so-called fast track authority, which is absolutely essential in order for the US administration essentially to close out the deal. And we can talk a bit more about fast track if you want in the Q&A. This agreement is years, it is years off being finalised. 2-3 years would be a great outcome, I think. The challenge here at heart is that tariffs are already low between the US and Europe. I mean, the trade is so significant that even small reductions are important. But what's always been difficult is these so-called behind-the-border measures, very different regulatory approaches in the US and Europe to different things. And it's not necessarily the case that even though everything gets characterised, I know this, I spend a lot of time in Europe, my wife's European, and the European view of the US is that, you know, when it comes to health, safety, food, you name it, European standards are better, they're higher, etc. And so, you know, the narrative in Europe has tended to be, you know, we don't want to have to adopt, you know, lower, worse, less sort of comprehensive US standards, right? This is a completely sort of false reality. It is simply the case, and in fact, it is simply the case that more often than not, the US just does things differently than Europe. In some areas, there's, I think, a very good case that the US actually regulates better than Europe. But that's sort of, you know, the narrative that the politicians need to work through in Europe to actually convince the population that at the end of the day, this is not going to affect these types of outcomes. So let me just give you one example. You know, if you take, I mean, there's a whole bunch of examples. I'll take a couple. I mean, there's a couple of hot button issues in that transatlantic relationship that sort of need to be addressed. Let's take genetically modified organisms, a very sort of controversial issue. Still, you know, controversial to some extent in the US, but not like it is in Europe. You know, there's essentially, you know, the US basically view is essentially that, you know, this has sort of been scientifically tested and proven to be safe, and you know, there's no reason that you know, it can't be, you know, sold and consumed. In Europe, in fact, the scientific body responsible for making these assessments more or less reach the same conclusion. But at the political level, there's such sort of an outcry amongst citizenry that Europe basically decided to block GMOs, even though the science said that it wasn't a problem. But you know, on another more prosaic level, if you take, say, for instance, automobiles, you know, big automobile industries in both the United States and Europe, both, you know, producing automobiles to very high safety standards, but doing it just in very different ways. And so, you know, Europe has, you know, particular dimensions that are required for bumper bars. You know, the lights, the headlights are different colours in Europe than they are in the United States. There's different sort of frameworks for how you build the seat and where the headrest goes. The dashboard has got different indicators on them, and the like. And so, it's not necessarily that US cars are safer or that European cars are safer, but they've actually just gone about regulating them in different ways. What it means, though, is that if you build a car coming out of Detroit or coming out of Kentucky or wherever for the US market, you are guaranteed you can't just sell that car into Europe because it doesn't meet European specific safety regulations. And the same is true, you know, for BMWs and Audis and the like. So, what it means is that you have to do costly, essentially, rejigging and redesigning of these vehicles to meet each other's standards. So this is one area where regulators can get together and try to actually agree that, in fact, even though they're going about these things differently, the safety outcomes are in fact the same, and so that you can reach a conclusion where you don't necessarily say we're going to do it the same way, but we're going to recognise that the differences lead to equivalent outcomes, and that would actually save significant costs, and that would be trade enhancing. So that's just one example of how you can make progress here, but I think it's also an example of how this is going to be quite complicated and hard. And this is these are the so-called regulatory issues that are part of this negotiation that both sides kind of need to get through. So the other, I'm going to get back to the strategic bit, but I just want to talk to you about two more important negotiations. Another one is the Trade and Services Agreement, which is, I was talking to you before about the importance of services for, you know, the US economy, and it's true of basically every developed economy, you know, services are an absolute key driver of economic growth. So this is basically a collection, and as you can see, a large collection of countries that have come together to basically agree to reduce barriers on trade and services alone. This is effectively a free trade agreement. It is being negotiated in Geneva, and you know, good progress has been made here. Possible outcomes this year, but this is certainly also going to be, you know, important for the United States in terms of creating opportunities, you know, in a whole range of countries around the world. And again, I think this is an agreement which will grow in time. China's express interest in joining, which would be a really big deal, obviously a very important market, and I think we'll see other countries joining as well. Finally, I just want to talk briefly about the World Trade Organization, which is the multilateral set of trade rules that govern actually world trade. And I think if I had been talking about this 5 years ago, I probably would have started with the WTO and then talked about the free trade agreements. And I think it's a sign of how things are at the moment, at least, that I've kind of done it the other way. The WTO, as you can see, more or less covers most of the globe in terms of coverage. It's a multilateral agreement, so everyone's a party, everyone gets the same deal in a sense. So the key to the WTO is that whatever your best trade deal that you offer any other country, you have to offer to every other WTO member. So it's, economists love it because it sort of is, it leads to the most efficient, most sort of economically optimal outcome. It's great from a development perspective because it gives developing countries sort of a say in how the global economy works. Another really important part is that it's got a very effective and well-regarded dispute settlement system. So the WTO, is a set of very complex, detailed legal agreements which actually can be litigated and appealed in a way that is familiar to a domestic legal system. Countries, there are actual judicial decisions that come out of the WTO. Countries comply with them. And so there's a lot of good work that still happens in the WTO. The challenge that the WTO has faced is that it has had an ongoing trade negotiation called the Doha round, which has been very, very difficult to conclude. And it's been going on for so long that it basically led the US to pursue all these other alternative trade agreements because the US basically, I think, decided in around 2008 that it was not going to be held, that its trade agenda was not going to be held hostage to the inability to make progress in the WTO. Now, the Doha round's been important for a whole bunch of reasons. At the end of the day, the way the WTO works is that every country has a vote. Whether you're the United States or whether you're Chad, your vote counts equally in the WTO. I mean, this is a formal matter. Informally, obviously, it's not necessarily the case, but it means that any country can hold up an outcome. And we've seen that happen before. So you've got to get you've got to get buy-in from everyone at some level. The other thing is that the global economy has sort of changed since the round was launched in 2001. China is a much bigger country now than it was in 2001, and that's true of a lot of developing countries, India, South Africa, Brazil, to name a few. So these countries are both having more of a say in these outcomes. They're also much more significant markets for the United States, as I've been talking about. And so the US has also been expecting these countries to do more in this round in order to bring it to a satisfactory conclusion. And so these dynamics are new, and they've made it difficult to conclude the round. The round's still going. The hope is that we are going to sort of finalise it, if not this year, next year, and then there will be a space in the WTO to start negotiating new rules that reflect new realities. But in the meantime, the kind of cutting-edge negotiation, the cutting-edge rules are all happening in these trade agreements that I've been talking about. Now, I just want to talk, I'll just go back briefly now to the strategic part of the TPP and also the transatlantic deal, because it's made, the US is explicit about it, Europe is explicit about it, and it's sort of an interesting overlay to what's happening at the moment. In the TPP context, I'm not sure if you've heard or you focus much on this so-called rebalancing to Asia, but it's basically the sort of administration's new sort of national security strategy, which basically says that Asia's where the action is, Asia's where the challenges are, and the US is going to, over a period of time, sort of allocate more military resources, more diplomatic resources to the Asia region. The sense being that there's been too much of a focus on the Middle East, and we need to refocus on this part of the world, which is dynamic and is growing, and there's a lot of opportunity, but also there's a lot of scope for the conflict there. The TPP has now been part of that rebalancing, and the administration has said very explicitly that there's this sort of military strategic component to it, but there's also an economic component to it, and the TPP is the economic component to it. Right? It's about sort of because a lot of it is about, underpinning, the US has alliances with a lot of the TPP countries. We talk about Japan, South Korea, Australia, to name a few, and it's sort of providing that economic underpinning to tie the countries closer together economically. It keeps the US sort of engaged in the region from an economic and trade perspective, as well as sort of from a military strategic perspective. So the importance of the TPP is, in addition to everything I've said, is that it's also become this sort of key pillar of this entire rebalancing towards Asia. If we turn now to Europe, you also see that the US and Europe are talking about the strategic dimension of the transatlantic deal. And this has become, sort of a particularly, I think, important part of the discussion in light of what Putin's been doing in Crimea and in Ukraine. It's different, the strategic sense of the TPP, and I think the US and Europe think about it a little bit differently. But from the European perspective at least, one of their key challenges with Russia is that they basically are too dependent on it for energy, and essentially for supplies of gas, which sort of basically, constrict their sort of manoeuvring room and their ability to respond to Russian aggression in that part of Europe. And so what they're hoping is that the transatlantic deal will free up supplies of growing US natural gas and oil to Europe, so that will also help them diversify their energy sources. And I think just more broadly, completing this deal will be sort of another sign of sort of US-European solidarity, and it will reinforce sort of US commitment to that part of the world. And that's also kind of a really good signal to be sending Russia in particular at a time like this. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that and open it up to Q&A. One up the back here.
What do you think the impact will be with the move by the Republicans to eliminate the Import-Export Bank?
So, well, it's a question whether that's going to be successful. I don't see it happening because I think the Democrats will block it. For me, I think there's a couple of good reasons why this is not a smart idea. One of them is that, whatever you think about the help that the bank might give large corporations like Boeing, etc., and you might think these companies can stand on their own 2 feet, it actually provides enormous amounts of support to small businesses who really do need it to actually be, to basically deal with the risks of international trade. The other part of it, I think, is that it's a form of sort of, I don't want to overstate and say unilateral disarmament, but the fact is almost every large exporting country has something like the Export-Import Bank. So, it's sort of, so in the real world, you can eliminate it, but all it means is that your businesses are going to be competing against other businesses that have that type of sort of basically risk insurance and trade finance that the Export-Import Bank provides. So you're going to provide a competitive disadvantage to your exporters. If you could sort of have a multilateral agreement that everyone agrees to stop doing this type of thing, then you could deal with that issue. But that's absolutely not on the table.
It's interesting that, and I appreciate that. Very, very good talk, and I guess it is going to be most likely, I guess, that we might get a fast track in the TPP this year. But I guess the thing is, too, when looking at NAFTA, this kind of combines NAFTA and then the recent Korean agreement, each one has produced a deficit an increase in our trade deficit. And the latest statistics, even with a 20% drop in oil imports, our deficit is still about the same in terms of trade. So I guess the question is, if we bring the specific one, TPP online, can you give me a guesstimate on the total deficit number? I'm just worried it's going to balloon. So I guess the question is, where will it go from that 4% trade deficit we have now? Where do you have some quantity on that? Do you have some feeling where that might go?
I don't, and here's why. A couple of very specific things, and then a couple of broader observations. So on the Korea FTA, it's absolutely too soon to say what the impact's going to be, because most of the key gains for the US are still being phased in. In fact, there was a recent, I know there was some talk recently about how, there was this growing deficit with Korea, but if you look at, on the automobile side, which is actually where a lot of the gains are, a lot of that hasn't even started to be phased in. So in fact, none of what we're seeing is really a product in the sense of that FTA. It's just the natural way that trade happens between the US and Korea. Let me just step back and say something a little bit more broadly about the trade deficit. The trade, so the trade deficit I actually think the trade deficit is better being seen as caused by a whole bunch of things, like more of a symptom of some key underlying economic drivers, rather than specifically sort of simply representing whether or not the US exports or imports too much. And the reason I say that is because the essential driver of the US trade deficit is whether or not the US is growing or not. If you do a graph, and I mean I didn't bring one today, but these are pretty readily available. I mean, if you look at the US trade deficit over the last 20 years and US economic growth, they pretty much track each other entirely. Essentially, when the US economy grows, the trade deficit grows. When the US economy shrinks, the trade deficit shrinks. And the reason for that essentially is that the demand for imports is in many respects just driven by broad macroeconomic factors in the United States. So, when businesses are growing, they're using more inputs. Some of them are imports and the like. And so, the idea that the trade deficit, so it gets to the question of whether or not the trade deficit is really a problem for the United States. I mean, I think over time, you would expect to see the trade deficit will shrink and the exchange rate will depreciate and you will move to a surplus. But, countries run trade surpluses for extended periods of time and don't actually grow much. I mean, if you look at, say, for instance, Japan's been running a trade surplus forever. I mean, really, only until recently have they gone into deficit, and that's simply because they shut down all their nuclear power plants and now are importing oil and gas and the like. But Japan's been running a trade surplus forever and has not been growing. And so the reason, so it gets back to, and so it's sort of a complicated argument, but I've been convinced by, the economic view that the trade deficit is really a symptom of broader underlying economic factors. It's not in and of itself a problem. It's really what's the issue is when you get very significant global imbalances and how those imbalances work their way out. I mean, if they work their way out gradually, then there's really no problem. If you have sort of sudden stops, that can be very kind of economically costly. But no one expects that to happen. But you have to kind of think about it and prepare and avoid it. So So specifically now on the trade agreements, at the end of the day, the US is a very open economy. Tariffs are very, very low. I mean, tariffs in the US are around 4%. The way the US tends to negotiate is the US basically says to the rest of the world, we're not really going to liberalise much. Maybe a little bit around the edges, but basically all the US really does is it says, look, we're going to lock in essentially our regulatory sort of framework, low tariffs and the way we sort of regulate, etc., into a treaty, so you get that certainty that you will always have access to our market at low rates, and that if we sort of if there's a period in the US where we wanted to raise, tariffs, or we wanted to be more kind of protectionist, you'd be protected from that, right? Because you'd have a treaty commitment that we wouldn't do it. So the gains really to the US are always on the export side. I mean, this is not true for most other countries in the TPP. They will lower their tariffs. They will open their markets, and for some countries, really quite considerably. So really, it's only upside in the sense of export opportunities for the US. But at the end of the day, these agreements are going to have almost no impact on the trade deficit, because it gets back to my original point, which is the trade deficit is not being driven by trade policy in that sense. It's really being driven by basically broad aggregate demand issues in the United States. And so, you know, if the US is growing, the trade deficit will grow for the time being, and if the US contracts, the trade deficit will close. And so, you know, I think if we accept that, then we can sort of, you know, that's where I think the debate should be then on the imbalance side. But happy to talk about it more afterwards, because it's a complicated debate. Next question. Yep.
What do you think the impact is on U.S. and world trade and U.S. and world employment with the currently surging U.S. dollar?
So you'd expect that, you know, the dollar's going to make imports cheaper, exports, you know, more expensive. You know, the you know, so I mean, so I don't think you're going to see much, like in terms of employment and wages in the US. I don't think we'll see much of a difference. I mean, you would expect under those circumstances that, in a sense, the export-orientated industries, because they might become less competitive, they will become smaller, and essentially you will see like the non-traded sector in the US grow as a result. And we do see that during periods of sort of extended appreciation. But the other thing to remember about the US, I think, is that businesses have often relatively little exposure to interest rate, and to exchange rate risk, because, you know, it's certainly true that exports will become cheaper, but, you know, most things get invoiced in US dollars, and so the exchange rate risk is often taken on the other side of the transaction, whether, you know, from the other business in the other country. For global businesses that are managing global supply chains, that do have affiliates in other countries, they're dealing with foreign currency issues all the time. And I think there's definitely a view that large companies, in fact, are going to be hurt by the growing exchange rate, because basically their overseas profits are going to be worth less when they get translated into US dollars. But I think the impact on the US on the trade side, it will be less, and it will take a lot longer to actually like flow through into anything real. So the question then will be probably how sort of sustainable is this sort of, you know, trajectory in the growth of the dollar. If it sort of is there for a while, then I think we'll see, you know, a gradual shift of resources sort of away from the traded sector to the non-traded sector. But I think broadly though that, you know, and employment should just adjust accordingly.
Authority is important, and was it present in previous trade agreements?
So fast track is basically you know, under the US Constitution, the Congress has authority over trade, and so what used to happen was the administration would go out and negotiate an agreement and then take it back to Congress for approval, and every, you know, congressperson would pick it apart, and, you know, the US didn't have to renegotiate it, and the negotiating, it was a sort of like an unworkable environment, and you know, negotiating partners, what they would do is, once they realised that, they would never put their best deal on the table, because they knew that, you know, even if the deal was final, it was, you know, the trade negotiator would have to come back and ask for more because Congress wasn't happy. And so this led to this kind of deal, which is fast track, which is basically the Congress agreed that instead of sort of picking apart trade deals, they would do only a yes or a no on the trade agreement. And in exchange sort of for that, the Congress would set set out goals for what the negotiators should achieve, and the administration would consult with Congress regularly about what was going on in the negotiations, and there'd sort of be a period of sort of, you know, consultation before they submitted the final agreement. So without TPA, without fast track, you know, basically the other parties are not going to put their final best offer on the table, because they're not going to feel confident that, you know, the US administration is not going to come back. And they're sort of now at the stage in the negotiations where it's sort of like all the issues that the negotiators can kind of clear away have been cleared away, and there's sort of some very hard, major issues that really require sort of political level attention to actually close the deal. And I think, but in order to kind of do that, then the US has got to be able to say, look, we've got fast track, so whatever we agree now is kind of a done deal.
You're talking about like the exports, imports, so like all this stuff we get from China imported here, the standards aren't the same like ours. You were talking about like Europe and United States, how the standards aren't the same,
Yeah.
like the GMO and all that. So why do we get all this stuff imported, like the lead in the, toys or whatever, they say, does that have anything, there's no standards that we can bring in?
No, there are, and anyone that exports a toy to the US has got to meet relevant health and safety standards. Yeah, absolutely. But what you'll see is that sometimes they don't, and it gets picked up, and then everything gets recalled and the like. But everyone has to meet the same standards. Yeah.
Want to leave anybody out? A last question or so? No? Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Josh, for putting these complex trade negotiations into context for us. Josh will be around if you have a question that you didn't want to ask in front of the group. And thanks for coming. We'll be back in 2 weeks. We'll switch gears and be focused a little more domestically. We'll have a colleague, Ross Hammond, out from Brookings, and we'll be talking about some social and health issues, obesity, tobacco, and Ross will be giving an interesting take on what the federal government is and isn't doing about that, but talking about some important initiatives that are happening at the local level and whether that's a more effective way to deal with these issues than perhaps the national government. You may not be surprised to learn that things aren't working as well as we might like them to be in Washington, D.C., whatever your political orientation is. And so some interesting things are happening at the state and local level that you might want to hear about. So I hope we see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks.